I do want to tell you about a woman named Wanda Diaz-Merced. Wanda Diaz-Merced is an accomplished astrophysicist. She lost her sight several years ago due to an extended illness, which makes the business of astrophysics extremely difficult. And in a field that uses primarily sight to study the vast universe, she and her team instead devised a method of translating the information that is being studied out in the universe into sound. It's called sonification. With the lilt and timbre of what sounds like music, the information collected about some of the most rare phenomena in the universe was studied and reported on by Dr. Merced. And in time, she discovered something that no one of her colleagues had yet discovered, a particular supernova, which is a brilliant death of a star, light years away, all through sound. In one instant, this supernova produced more energy than our sun produces in 10 days, all with the power of sound. Without sight, she was listening. If only we could listen like this. Instead, we hear everything going on, sometimes too loudly. Nonstop information, nonstop communications, especially with each other. Information is zooming past us at infinite speeds. And what we're hearing in the midst of all this is a sound that, like, we used to hear. Remember? I mean, really, I'm starting to date myself. Remember when the phone used to connect to the internet back in the 1990s, back so long ago? There was that, like, discordant, screechy technological sound. Remember that? It's hard. It's hard to hear that for more than a few seconds, for sure. You know, you really only know that you're capable of listening when you escape to some remote mountain or some secluded beach on a distant island in the ocean. And there you can hear the sounds of nature, and you can listen to your soul once again. It's too hard to hear in the world around us. At best, we escape. Even better, it's Rosh Hashanah. And it's our chance to listen to the sounds of our heritage. There is a difference between seeing or hearing. The kind of listening that we are reminded to practice today takes us all the way back to the origins of our creation. So listen to the beginning of this story with all its poetry and grandeur. In the beginning, the God of the Torah forms the void with words. Let there be light. And light enters into the universe, and the light is defined as tov, good. After each moment of creative forces manifest, the accomplishment is deemed good, tov. Land is formed, tov. Vegetation sprouts forth, tov. Animals roam the earth, each according to its ability, tov. Tov is everywhere. And the crowning achievement of creation, the human being, is tov me'od, very good. The words tell a simple story, actually. Being is good, and the human being is very good. Now, as a story about us, it affirms that our very existence is exceedingly pleasing to the author of creation. We are glorious entities. We have divine capacity. We are very good. How surprising when you listen carefully that the story changes. God utters into creation that something is lo tov, not good, when the human being stands alone. Without a partner, the human being is incomplete. But it's more than a physical progenitor of the species. This loneliness is of divine concern. Lo tov heyot adam levado. The human being is not good alone. When you hear the story, you imagine that alone means that he doesn't have a human partner. Especially since in the next few verses, when you read, Eve is brought into the garden. But when we listen, though, we can imagine this loneliness is of a deeper and divine concern than simply solitude. What God finds imperfect in creation is a crisis of being. The human being that God creates is fearful and skeptical and doubting and despairing. That is what is defined as alone. Men and women were not expelled from paradise for eating the forbidden fruit. But they were expelled because their disobedience was born from doubt, from a doubtful existence. So even in a world with just one other human being, or in a world with 7.5 billion human beings, we can still feel totally alone. Earlier this year, it was stunning to learn that the people of England tried to address this problem in an entirely new way. In light of the increasing numbers of people who are isolated and marginalized from the public fora, they created a governmental position called a Minister of Loneliness. Loneliness of this magnitude, in the words of some, is a real diagnosable scourge. So they created a position where it is a person's sole responsibility to alleviate, to avert, to assuage the kinds of loneliness that people feel. Should we wonder for a moment if our legislators will do the same? There is uncertainty here. There is doubt here. And in what we're hearing, it's making us so lonely that we have to create positions for people to help us overcome our solitude. This is a joke that was once told by Rabbi Shoish on this very bima. Two Hasidim were talking, and one turns to the other and says, you know, there are only two kinds of people in this world, the Jews and the non-Jews. And the second one nodded in agreement. About the non-Jews, we don't even have to talk about. And among the Jews, the first says to the second, there are the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim. The other nods in agreement. And the non-Hasidim, why even discuss them? And you know that among the Hasidim, there are the Sadmar and the Lubavitch. And the second asks, oi, why even talk about the Lubavitch? And you know that among the Hasidim, there are those that go to our yeshiva and go to the other yeshiva. And from that yeshiva, well, the students really don't know anything from nothing. And the second nods. And the people from our yeshiva, well, there really is you and me. And well, you know how little you know. In loneliness, we have a compulsion to divide the world. Dividing between us and them seems to resolve our uncertainty, but it has only driven us away from each other. That's why it's so easy for us to define they and them before we look at ourselves. And sometimes we hear what we want to hear before listening to what they and them really have to say. We cannot eradicate this kind of uncertainty through legislation. It requires action. It requires moral balance. In other words, the uncertainty we feel is not resolved by removing doubt at all, but it is only to be found in the truthful, confident wrestling with moral virtues. Our Torah has taught us that loneliness occurs when we lodge a wedge between us and humanity. Lo tov heyot adam levado. God doesn't want us to doubt, to stop listening, to be alone. We hear everything so well today, but in truth, we haven't been listening very well at all. It's as if we are left with the sting of punishment for what then must have been felt as a divine flaw. And as a result, we have become experts of stamping out all forms of doubt. Totalitarian rule, stamp it out. Origins of the cosmos, stamp it out. Diseases, poverty, homelessness, being a stranger, stamp it out. Loneliness, create a ministerial position and stamp it out. It is as if we experience this sting of punishment once and we are obsessed to avoid it once again. Judaism has much to say about this. In one respect, the Torah is a long address to the problem of loneliness. And so in the Torah, we find a second and equally compelling response, a call for faith, of discovering and trusting the goodness that lies within in the face of isolation and despair. And we have heard this trusting voice before. We heard it not so long ago, in 1943. In 1943, the Second World War was raging on. The forces of good and evil were battling out on the fields in Europe. And in France, Germany and the Vichy regime collaborated and turned over Jews to the German forces, sending thousands and thousands of Jews off to death camps. In one small hamlet in the southern central part of France, Protestant pastor André Truckmay and his wife Magda knew the terrifying threat posed by those who sought to expel Jews and the danger in disobedience. They knew what it meant to be persecuted themselves. Their small community had long taken refuge from a hateful society to protect their own religious beliefs. The Truckmays and the citizens of Les Chambon willingly and consistently took in Jews who fled persecution when they came knocking at the door. The school had 18 students at the outbreak of the war. And by 1944, there were 350 students. Anyone who could count knew what was happening. Even after the authorities arrested Truckmay and detained him for several days, he vocally expressed his commitment to protect the Jews who sought refuge in his town. I do not know what a Jew is. I only know human beings. There are so many stories like this, and in some ways even more heroic. But what's particularly remarkable about this story is how Magda Truckmay reflected that it never occurred to her to say no when people sought refuge in her home. I did not know that it would be dangerous, she said. Nobody thought of that. Malcolm Gladwell, in his 2015 book, David and Goliath, muses on her words. I did not know that it would be dangerous. Nobody thought of that. In the rest of France, all people thought about was how dangerous life was. But the people of Les Chambon were past that. As religious people, The Trachmanes and the people of Le Chambon drew upon a wellspring of wisdom. But we ask, what did it take for someone to get past their fear, their doubt, their uncertainty? What that is seems to be unclear. It's not so unclear at all. That is very simple. That is when we see the other as means to an end. That is when we allow the crisis of loneliness to suppress and isolate one another, to see the other as less than the goodness of being that we were created to embody. That is when we stop listening and hear the words, the voices of fear, of dissent born from doubt. That is when the will of others is too great for us to rise up against and speak out in a clarion call for goodness. That remains the crisis of modernity. And yet, that also defines moral courage. Moral courage is a fundamental recognition of what right behavior is when it comes to care for our fellow human beings. Regardless of background, religious or worldly experience and education, the essential truths of dignity for all human beings and the protection and safety of those who are vulnerable are inalienable rights of all human beings. Moral courage is when you remember the way we were created. The way we were created. B'Tselem Elohim, our tradition teaches us, in the image of God. And to fight for and protect that image from any kind of danger. There was no loneliness in the decision to save Jews. In fact, Pastor Trachme, his wife Magda, and the people of Le Chambon, and the countless others who saved our people in the darkest of times were never alone. These are the people who restore hope for us. Jews seek out morally courageous people because we are listening carefully. There's an old tradition our people have that's carried us through times of uncertainty, much of like what we find ourselves in today. In these times, our people imagined that there was a select group of people whose righteousness sustains the entire world. And as long as they're alive, no matter how uncertain the world seems, hope is on the horizon. We call them Lamed Vavniks. Maybe you've heard of this. It's an idea that these 36, that's Lamed Vav in Hebrew, righteous individuals sustain the whole world by their care and responsibility. They embody moral courage. Moral courage like this is part of our Torah. It's our root story. Abraham, Moshe, Miriam, Devorah, Jeremiah, and countless others are the characters who listen when we seek certainty amidst ambiguous social climates. Their lives are our models. And in this great country, and in this excellent society, in which we have today been grappling with the capacity to act with moral courage, it is no mistake that we hear more often than listen when the scions of our leadership, thought, and culture are dissolving by their deeply personal failures every time we turn on the news. But we should not confuse anger with moral courage. That is coming to an end. This was once heard over the tranquil waters of Walden Pond, just outside of Boston, in 1843. It's worth telling and retelling the story once again, because it is a story of two people and how they see each other so differently. On one bank of Walden Pond was found a man named Frederick Tudor, who made his business collecting ice from the lakes of the Northwest. And he went on his way to make great fortunes shipping this ice all around the world. Tudor was known as the Ice King of Boston in those days. For those who have ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, there's a man named Abe Froman, the Sausage King of Chicago. And I think that Frederick Tudor's Ice King appellation is worthy of celebration. On the banks of the opposite shore, however, the philosopher Henry David Thoreau watched as industrious workers toiled to retrieve huge blocks of ice from the frozen waters. Thoreau was an entrepreneur of a different sort, eschewing material success and contemplating big ideas as the means to a fulfilling life. Imagine what the two heard on the other sides of the lake. The quiet naturalist saw the industrialist on the other side of the pond and heard the operations of selfish gain. The industrialist saw the naturalist on the other side of the pond and assumed that a protest was about to begin. But Thoreau spoke differently. He said, "The sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, drink at my well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges." And out of this, a great image was born, that of the moral citizen, pursuing industry to enjoy material success and pursuing the contemplative life. Discovering fulfillment in the interpretations of experience go together. It's what makes us an exceptional people, an exceptional society. Moral citizenship is the centering force of our tradition and our society. It's a concept of balance that helps us act our best, industry and nature. Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, to protect and preserve in one breath, just as we say in our Lecha Dodi prayers on Erev Shabbat. It's a balance between building and creating, between serving others and plumbing the depths of interior life that is woven into the most brilliant threads of our social fabric. Lamed Vavniks, those 36 righteous people, live their lives in balance. And without that balance, we unravel into a colorless monotony, a hollow definition of self that stands for nothing and uncritically complies with a popular will. We are not these kinds of people. And it does feel like we are out of balance. For good reason. Our times are so uncertain. We're not sure where the scales should tip. The great image of balance is found in an equally weighted scale. Take a trip to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and you'll find those scales of justice displayed throughout the impressive building. You won't find the scales leaning too much one way or the other. Yet, we are desperately seeking a hand to tip the scales of justice in favor of compassion and safety and health and vitality for all. Lady Justice is that symbol that reminds us of this value. You know her. She stands tall, but she has a blindfold over her eyes. Justice is not a sense of vision. It is the elegance of listening. In Hebrew, the word for balance is moznaim, and it's rooted in the very same word ozen, the ear, a sense of listening that brings balance. Moral listening is the idea that we need to focus on today. It's hard to know, though, who and what ideas we should be listening to. And honestly, it's harder than ever before. In a time when everything seems to be updated and improved every 2 years, listening like this is a challenge. When voices are constantly shrilling that the media is fake, or when the steady onslaught of noise in the form of salacious discoveries of impropriety dominate our consciousness, we don't know what or who to really listen to. Just last week, listen to what Adrian Chen wrote in The New Yorker. There has been a growing sense among the mostly liberally minded observers that the platforms of championing openness is at odds with the public interest. The image of the Arab Spring activists using Twitter to challenge oppressive dictators has been replaced in the public imagination by that of ISIS propagandists luring vulnerable Western teenagers to Syria via YouTube's and Facebook chats. The openness that was said to bring about a democratic revolution instead seems to have torn a hole in the social fabric. Our social fabric is torn by our uncertainty for what to listen to. This calls for this moral virtue of listening. And it was just also last week that we heard the words of John McCain. Upon his passing, listen to his words. We weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all the corners of the globe. We weaken it when we hide behind walls rather than tear them down, when the doubt centers on the power of our ideals, rather than trust these ideals to be the great force for the change they have always been. These words that he wrote are more powerful because we know the one who said them understood conflict and uncertainty. And if you were listening to the many stories that were pouring out about John McCain, it was most impressive that this man, under so many years as a prisoner, tried to take his life not once but twice. What kind of doubt and uncertainty a person like this must wrestle with and then emerge to speak of this kind of power is something that we must listen to. Rabbi Schulweis also sought out and beckoned us to celebrate those courageous heroes who listened carefully in times of great uncertainty, and they acted with conscience. He encouraged us to practice the Jewish value called hakarat hatov, the recognition of goodness. And he based this action on the deep listening of Jewish tradition. It's not the strong-willed expressions of moral courage, nor the witty eruditions of a moral citizen that compel us to practice hakarat hatov, or to recognize goodness. We are meant to become the masters of moral listening, taught Rabbi Schulweis. And so we too pay attention and listen to this sensitivity, to hear through the fray, to focus on essential concerns of human beings worthy of defense and protection. Through debate and conflict, through argument and dissent, moral listening points the compass towards the north, towards the dignity of all humanity. And in these times of great uncertainty, look and listen to those who focus their compass north, the Lamed Vavniks, because they are the voices who speak for balance. They are the embodiment of wisdom through careful consideration and patient and measured responses. They are the greatest models in a time of uncertainty that we should be looking to. And if you know this old tradition, the greatest truth about Lamed Vavniks is that they can be anywhere around us. It's quite possible that there is a Lamed Vavnik or two in our holy congregation. It's even possible that that Lamed Vavnik is sitting right next to you now. It's even more possible that the Lamed Vavnik could be you. Now is the time. Now is the time for Lamed Vavniks to stand up and be recognized. Now is the time for your courage, your sense of balance, and deep listening to enlighten and inspire us all. My prayer, our prayer, is that this new year brings inspiration, confidence, a newfound certainty that we all can become masters of listening. Lamed Vavniks, for ourselves, for the ones that we love, for us all. L'Shana Tova.